What breaks MedTech timelines?
Good morning, and welcome to What Breaks MedTech Timelines, because many of you in this room have a medical device or a concept. Some of you actually have a prototype, but all of you have one thing in common. Along your journey, you will need to field clinical research. And this panel is going to offer you the lived experience, the scars from what can actually break that clinical timeline that you need to get you over the line. Today we're going to explore the 5 biggest ways that MedTech timelines can be derailed. They start with protocol development, moving on to misunderstanding regulatory needs and requirements. There's site activation, which incorporates enrollment and execution. Now, each one of our panelists have a very specific background to give you this lived experience. So we're going to start with Lian Cunningham, 20 years of leading clinical programs, currently the VP of Clinical Affairs at Endogenex, where she leads clinical research around diabetes devices. Lynn Carney, she heads up alliances at Medmarc, an insurer for MedTech manufacturers and distributors. Charles Dunham, a partner at Greenberg, Traurig. Charles covers the questions around regulatory, compliance, reimbursement, fraud and abuse, digital health. Consider him your FDA-adjacent voice. And then we have Mark Swanson, heads up, 25 plus years, if I'm not mistaken, of QMS, quality, and an ISO expert. So when it comes to the documentation and all of the underpinning of a clinical trial, that's where you come in. I'm Joseph Panetta. I am the Chief Marketing Officer from Ascend Clinical Research. We're based in Australia, and we cover APAC. And we've had a bird's eye view on a lot of these things that derail a clinical timeline because of where we are. So I want to start with Lian and talking about protocol design. From your experience, what's the most common mistake in protocol design that doesn't show up until down the road? Is it during program timeline development, or is it through sort of looking at a single study?
Sure. So as we all know, in MedTech, clinical evidence is not just for regulatory approval, right? You serve another audience, and a good evidence is foundational for your investor confidence, company value, physician adoption, reimbursement, eventually your market access. So it is critically important that when you start your clinical journey, you have your full program in mind, and not just look at this my first study, but really map out what you need to do throughout your product development and clinical development. Protocol design is a major part of it, and there are many potential protocol pitfalls. In the interest of time, I'll just talk about a few that's maybe most common and or most impactful ones. The first one actually is number one reason for protocol amendments are eligibility criteria. So companies typically, and your medical advisors typically start with a good intention. They want to start with scientifically rigorous and clinically selective, right? They say, okay, you need this set of criteria. If you have a number of clinical advisors, everyone says, oh, you need to exclude this type of patient, you need to exclude that type of patient. Every single criteria on its own makes perfect sense. But in combination, you can end up with a set of criteria that patients really don't exist in real world. So this is something sometimes the team don't appreciate until you actually start screening. Then you see every patient screen failed, you can't enroll a patient. So that's number one reason we typically see. Second reason that the program can be delayed or get sidetracked is endpoint selection. So you can have a poorly defined endpoint, or you can sometimes select wrong endpoint altogether. Hopefully, you have all done your homework, looked at whether your technology or similar sort of technology therapy, there's an FDA guidance document, or there's precedent on what endpoint is clinically valuable or regulatorily acceptable. In addition to look at those, you also should think about how to optimize your endpoint or endpoint definition to highlight your benefit, like the benefit of your technology. If you don't do that, you can end up have poorly defined endpoint. What is the definition of procedure success? What is the efficacy criteria? And what is acceptable? So that's very often the second pitfall people don't recognize, then all of a sudden realize, gosh, my endpoint isn't really what I want. I have to redo the study or do a protocol amendment. The third issue is really the complexity of the protocol. The protocol complexity has increased significantly over the years. But when you start to design a study, your marketing or your medical advisor says, oh, it must be nice to also connect this imaging data. It must be also nice to connect that data. Every single assessment increases friction at the site and with the patient. So if these must-haves, not only very costly, it can significantly derail your timeline. So the key is to be disciplined so that you focus on the critical data that you need for assessing safety, efficacy, and the value of your therapy. The last, but not the least, is fail to plan for changes. So in medtech development and the technical learning and device iteration is always inevitable. If you don't plan for changes at the very beginning, it can set you back a year, even longer. So you really have to build those in.
Excellent, thank you. So it's the perfect patient paradox, the endpoint sort of overreach, complexity versus simplicity, and then plan for the unplannable. And Charles, I want to turn to you because while Lian has covered protocol development, you brought up something that actually comes before all of that, which is something around reimbursement and how you might actually get paid for this device.
Yeah, and actually it's a theme that I'm glad to hear has been resonating throughout these programs and the sessions. It is about that business model, thinking about that commercialization, bringing it to market. And you would say, well, that seems like a no-brainer, right? But it is a challenging area because most of the time founders or developers, especially when the startups, they're focused in on and thinking about technology and R&D, and less on thinking about, well, how am I going to get this to the market? And so we've heard a lot about this. I'll give like more real-world examples, right? I was on a call just last week with the CEO, and we were doing a due diligence on behalf of an investor group, and the CEO said, essentially, it's always a challenge for MedTech and reimbursement. It's always a challenge at this stage. And that was the response to, well, what's your game plan for getting onto the market, getting reimbursed, right? And so you don't want to be that CEO having that response within those, on that point. And so you need to incorporate concepts of reimbursement, concepts of how I'm going to get to this to market. Am I going to be indirectly selling it to a hospital or health system, clinic, what have you, the B2B, or am I going to actually be the one that's dropping a claim, getting reimbursed by a government, a commercial payer, or being reimbursed by the plan, self-funded plan, what have you. And the reason why it's the challenge is that we have a fragmented system in the US. Difficult all around the world to get reimbursement, but in the US you got to jump through the regulatory hurdles of getting to the market. And we're talking about safety, efficacy, things of that nature which the FDA is reviewing, but that's not what payers are reviewing. They're reviewing clinical utility, the real value. Medical necessity is the term that they're looking into. So when you're designing your protocols, you need to design the protocols so that you're actually capturing data, real world evidence associated with that clinical utility, with that value. Because if you're not doing that, what are you going to do then? You're going to have to go back to the drawing board. You're going to have to figure out how to pull that data out, or you've missed the design and you're laughing because that's not possible, because, and the thing I'll say there, and it goes into another topic that we're going to discuss, is about that data. Why is it so critical, and why I think we're seeing so many health systems, academic medical centers, institutions really getting involved more heavily with MedTech, is because they have access to that clinical feedback, that clinical data, the outcomes. That's the type of information the payers are looking for. And so when you're designing those protocols, that's why I always say, yeah, you need to think about that in tandem with the technology, with the research in those trials.
So it's the reimbursement strategy that you need to have tight, because it will inform the endpoints and the patients inform the input. So all of these things are very much connected. Lynn, I want to turn to you now, because it sort of segues into how and when you would deploy insurance for a trial, and does it change based on site locations and geographies?
Absolutely. Sorry, I wasn't on. So, absolutely. We are happy to cover you wherever in the world. However, many countries want local admitted coverage. And you can sort of gauge it as the less developed countries take longer. To sort of gauge it by that. We had a trial in Nigeria that took several months, and they require cash before it covers, so you have to pay for it. And then it's when they get around to, Nigerian government, get around to actually processing the paperwork, your trial can start. So if you wait to the last minute in one of those countries, you can be delayed, and you're just sitting there, running through your burn rate, waiting. Your patients can't start because you don't have the proper insurance in place.
That's a really great sort of buttress to what Lian was talking about in terms of program complexity, because when you start site selections in other geographies, this is where you're going to have to plan for those kinds of situations, right?
Absolutely, and I'm happy to sort of guide you as to what countries take the longest and what their requirements are.
And expectations and needs. So Mark, I want to turn to you, because one of the things that you brought up on our call as we prepared for this was the role of documentation about execution, and not just about a single study, but over the entire clinical life cycle. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I watched the previous panel, and they referenced some of the things we can learn from the pharma side, and that piece on data integrity. Our phrase that we often use is, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. It's not, in other words, not true. And so you have to look at all of that and how you're capturing the data. Your quality management systems and those types of things come alongside of that to help you with those quality records, all of those pieces. I was chuckling a little bit because most of us are still stuck in some of the old language, right? Safety and efficacy. Mm-hmm. But I got to say, the new QMSR, people pay attention. It's safety and performance. It's that whole piece. As you go towards Europe, you have to have clinical evaluation reports. You have to have that documentation that goes along with your risk management file. These are all the things that we're doing in design and development. So again, what we used to call a design history file is now a design and development file. It takes into account all of those things. So developing the clinical protocols, gathering the data, understanding your endpoints, having the data to back everything up. You can't just send summary data anymore. They want to see all of the data. And if you don't have that, if you've not, hopefully transitioned to electronic records, because they don't want to see the paper. We send our stuff into FDA now. It's all electronic. It's all attached to that eStar form. It's all of those electronic records. So you have to be able to keep those things. Having an electronic quality management system to be able to keep those records, all of that kind of stuff, and then, again, organizing that into the system, because a requirement of MDR is that all has to be searchable. And it's only searchable if it's available electronically. So keep in mind those records. Your quality management system is going to be the backbone of that.
And you want to institutionalize that as you develop your protocol, because there are some sites that will ask you about your QMS system because they want to know that they can adapt to it or execute it. Right. We had a recent conversation with a company where they were asking their sites to fill out a physical piece of paper and fax it in. Imagine how many of those didn't happen. But look, everything in life comes down to timing. And when we're talking about a clinical trial, that's sequencing. And it's something that we see first-time or early CEOs miscalculate. At the end of the day, a large part of the trial's success is going to be, are the sites enrolling? Is the data being properly captured, to your point, Mark? And are they being monitored? Now, Lian, you've worked with sites across the globe. What separates a site that says they can enroll from ones that actually deliver?
Sure. So when you look at the site, the difference is not about whether the site is enthusiastic, whether the PI is have good reputations and is very famous. The key boils down to two things. One is whether they have dedicated research infrastructure, and two is whether they have access to the right patient. So very often you talk to a site, they look at your protocol, they say, for example, diabetes. And they look at your protocol, they say, we have a lot of diabetes patients, right? But a good site, they will actually run their patients through your inclusion-exclusion criteria and really understand how many patients they can enroll. And another issue very often is you have a very well-known investigator or thought leader, you want to work with them, and they say, who's your study coordinator? They can say, oh, my resident can do it, my fellow can do it. Do not do that with your site, because they don't deliver, or they do poor job. So a good site is really have dedicated research coordinator, access to the right patient, and strong engagement from the PI. Not only the PI should be available, but the PI should also be able to solve bottlenecks. For example, in your device study, other things that potentially can impact your enrollment is if you need OR, availability of OR, availability of imaging, and the other specialties may be a bottleneck. So the PI needs to be really, really engaged and drive the program forward for you.
There's a lot to consider. And for those of you who don't know, enrollment is the #1 timeline killer for a clinical trial, just FYI. Charles, regulatory timelines. How do they play into the sequencing of like a clinical trial, getting it up and running?
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that you are beholden to these federal, sometimes state agencies about their timelines for you to be able to get into the market. And so if we take the FDA and the benefit of having at least timelines that are in their statutorily regulatory, they do not follow them. And so, to the best that they can, and unfortunately, when the market's looking in, investors are looking in, and they see these agencies that are responsible for otherwise your timelines getting to market, being able to assist you, they don't like to see turbulence within those agencies. And that's what we're experiencing, right? Makari just resigned yesterday, right? And so, CDRH is an excellent group of folks. I know several of them very well, and especially in the digital health, side of things, they really are releasing excellent guidance materials out there. But you do need to understand that when a lot of people come to us as counsel, they're wanting to avoid having to go to the FDA. Right? They're wanting to say, what is our classification? Can we be class 1 exempt? Can we be a wellness device? Because all the guidance now is out there. Well, I read and I understand that I could probably fit into this category. And so when you get to a point where you're launching or you're thinking about how to launch and get to the market, and you put yourself in that classification, your timeline can be greatly disrupted if the FDA or anything comes in and says, no, we don't agree with you. So with those early discussions with those agency, and Q-subs and all of that is very important, can really impact those timelines. You don't want those adverse instances.
I think it was on the prior panel, someone said the average for a MedTech device to get to market is 7 years and $35 million if there isn't a change in the regulatory body, which is a big if, I think. Lynn, based on your experience, what is the delta between protocol ready and first patient in? And why do you think so many CEOs have magical thinking and that they think that's a really short timeline?
Well, I don't know that I can get inside their heads, but I think they're just wearing so many hats that they don't think about, I think the previous panel was talking about all the things they have to do early. And I know in our industry, the insurance, no one thinks of us to the last second. And granted, we can turn it around quickly, but as I mentioned before, a lot of other jurisdictions cannot. But other than that, I feel like, I did want to say something, somebody mentioned something in the protocol, is I do recommend you talk to a risk manager and experiences life sciences broker early while you're developing your protocol, because your protocol says when your insurance starts. We had a gentleman that was doing knee replacement, but his was aftercare for knee replacements. His protocol included the surgery. So that means his insurance is going to include the surgery, which obviously is going to cost more because now he's basically picking up the med mal for the doctor putting the knee in. So luckily we got in early enough on him and said, well, you just kind of need to tweak this protocol so that you're only picking up post-surgery.
Aftercare, yeah. It's interesting because I'm hearing a recurring theme, and I'm hoping the audience is picking this up. A holistic approach to this. It is not about a single study. It's about what do you ultimately want to achieve and reverse engineer all of the elements to get you there. That's a very important consideration. And Mark, I want to ask you about, since we're talking about quality management systems, how do they show up as a clinical delay? And when do people see that? Do they see it early on or is it downstream?
If there's one thing that all y'all are sitting out there, you need to understand, is you need some of these pieces early. You can't wait. I mean, you talk about wanting to avoid FDA. People don't like to have the quality regulatory people around, it seems like. But I'm telling you, what happens is if you don't have the verification and validation data, if you don't have that design and development documentation, that kind of stuff, you're not going to get an IDE. You're not going to get a doctor to say, yeah, we'll sign on, because you haven't even proven that your device actually works. And so that's the function of the quality management system. Through the design and development, through the documentation, that you have some evidence that you've done a bench study, you've done a cadaver study, you've done some of these stuff that have to be done before you get to the clinical side. If you don't have that documentation, if your quality management system's not in place, you've not met some of those initial, feasibility pieces and have that documentation, sorry, they're going to say, nope, you're not ready.
Yeah.
And so you need to have that quality management system. Don't wait on this. You don't need to have a full quality management system. You don't need to have CAPA, complaint handling, all these things that you'll hear the industry talk about that are big deals to the FDA because that's what they write findings on in inspections. You don't need that in design and development, but you do need document control, records control, some management reviews, supplier controls, all of those things that come from your quality management system. If you don't have it, you're not going to get it because, I hate to say it, CROs are a supplier to you. If you're not managing them correctly, then they're not going to do the things that they're supposed to do to get the protocol, get the enrollment, all of those types of things. So that's where your quality management system comes in.
If I can add to that, just,
Yes, please.
I'm pounding on the notion of, okay, I want to get to the market, right? That's always in the head. That QMS is not a quick thing to implement, like design and implementation, and you need that to be able to finally get the FDA, the backbone. It's not only from the protocols to make sure everything's compliant, probably insurance pieces of the puzzle as well, but the FDA is going to want to see that, and they're going to want to, like anything, see that you've implemented it to a point where if they come in and they do a survey or they look to that, and there are penalties associated with, saying that you do have a QMS in place, and the process with ISO and the like, right? That takes time. So again, thinking about it ahead of time, not putting it on the table, for another day, not taking that serial approach as we've talked about, is really going to be a great service to, and show investors as well that you understand all those obligations that you need to put in design.
One of the things that we hear a lot about in MedTech is that you can iterate as you go along, and you may iterate and find that you started with a particular notion that it would have an endpoint, but you discovered along the way that there was another indication or application. Device development QMS gives you the rationale for that switch, right? And that's where, Charles, if I'm not mistaken, the regulatory is going to want to see the proof behind what did you learn, why did it drive that change? And then, to Lian's point about protocol, that's going to change your patient, your indication, your endpoint. So all of these things live in an ecosystem that are interconnected and interdependent upon one another. And you definitely need a partner who can understand all of those pieces and how they work. But let's expand on regulatory, because regulatory is the glove, part of the hand-in-glove relationship between clinical and regulatory. And I'm going to come back to you, Charles. In your view, what do early-stage companies, how do they get regulatory wrong that creates later delays or even invalidates data that they've already collected?
Well, I mean, I think we touched upon a number of the areas where you get regulatory wrong, the design, understanding what those communications with FDA and specifically what they're going to want to see. So having those conversations early, again, I'll roll that into the again, IP strategy and reimbursement strategy. They all are, hand in glove, because when you're, let's just take on the IP side of the puzzle, the design and the ownership of that data now is becoming far more important. When you're needing to go out and establish relationships with those institutions, hospitals or health systems or clinics, gathering that data, there's a lot of question about who owns that data. And from an IP trade secret strategy, you need to sort that out up front, because it's the backbone, again, of what you're going to be submitting to the FDA, what you're going to be submitting to the payers. It's the backbone of what you're going to be submitting if you're going to file with the patent, the patent office. So again, it's when I say regulatory, I think of all of the things that you're going to need to have to submit to the FDA, and people think that that's the only piece of the puzzle, or that's the primary prominent piece of the puzzle. You need to incorporate it all. You need to have, and we talk to our clients, IP strategy mixed with regulatory strategy, mixed with reimbursement strategy. They all play an important factor in designing it, and will impact significantly your timelines. If you're thinking about things at stages, you're going to have to go back and to beginnings sometimes on that, and that costs money, and investors don't want to see that.
No, and no one participating wants to see those delays. But you mentioned something really important, and Lian, I want to talk with you about this, because you have a lot of experience going with different geographies, and there are different regulatory and sort of competent authorities in different geographies. Can you speak to how you address that when you're doing a global study?
Sure. When you do global study, you have to understand where you want to go, and whether you have relatively good alignment on your requirement. Otherwise, you can be really out of sync between geographies. I think you want to avoid that. In the context of clinical study, selecting a geography, I think you want an environment or geography that has a regulatory framework that is efficient, transparent, and predictable. So you need all three of those. Otherwise, it could really delay your timeline. You could have, for example, US is relatively transparent, is predictable, but it's not necessarily efficient. And you can have a geography that someone come to tell you to say, they require very little data I can get you protocol approved. If I submit, I know someone from Ministry of Health, I can get you approval in a month. But if somebody else submit this, you might get approval 6 months or 12 months. So that's the issue, right? It's not predictable and it's not transparent. And for a tech company, it's very difficult to manage this inability to predict your requirement, inability to predict your timeline. Higher requirement, higher standard is not a bad thing because you know what is required, you can meet it. And unpredictability is the one you want to really avoid.
That makes a lot of sense. And Lynn, this bleeds into what you were talking about in terms of the insurance requirements. Do you sometimes find yourself counseling sponsors on certain jurisdictions over others because of this?
Absolutely. Just yesterday, I was talking to someone about that was going to run a trial in Panama. You're welcome to run a trial in Panama. Everybody has, all the insurance carriers have a tax issue there, so it's very hard to find coverage there. So they decided to switch to a different Latin American country. And it was just like that. They just found a different CRO while we were on the phone, because I guess she had been speaking to a couple. So, it just, I know CEOs don't need anything else to do, but you will try to make it easy. Other carriers, life science brokers, will try to make it easy for you. Just make a quick call before you start doing, get so far down the road you can't change.
Yeah, and I think this is about choosing a location to have your clinical research done. We call it a horses for courses approach. There are different geographies that you would go to potentially for different reasons. If what you need is clinical information to validate something for your board or a direction that you're going for, you may not necessarily need all of the bells and whistles around a tier 1 quality data deliverable, right? And there are certain jurisdictions you can go to for that. However, there's also the thought that, oh my, if I'm going to go for an FDA clearance down the road, I want all of my data to ladder up to that. And that's a different decision about your geographical location. And Mark, I want to wrap up this regulatory conversation around quality systems. Sort of the notion of translating a theoretical risk into something that is actively managed during trial execution and how geographies can change that.
Yeah, so, I'll start with the number one question we get asked when we talk about clinical is, do I need to have clinical data in the US? The answer actually is no. But there's this thought that you have to have patients that are reflective of the patients that are going to use your product. So that's the general thinking. If you're going to sell your product in the US, yeah, you should have some US data. Does it all need to be the US? No. If you're going to have patients in the EU, in Latin America, all of these different places, your quality system should point out, the differences in all those regulatory pieces, the differences in what the expectations are, so that, again, this is working as a system. It's not just regulatory, it's not just quality, it's not just clinical. It's quality, regulatory, clinical. It's all of this piece together. And so your quality management system should be designed to support that. It should be designed to understand what the requirements are for Brazil that are different from the US. And there's differences in quality management system requirements. There's differences in the regulatory submissions. There's differences in, you have to have market authorizations holders, somebody that lives in their countries, the one that's distributing your product. Mm-hmm. You can't just distribute product from the US into Australia or Japan or those types of things. You have to understand what are the quality pieces. And again, our main quality management system standard, ISO 13485, I have the pleasure of being in that working group and working on it, writing the guidance. These are some of the things we're trying to highlight so that people understand this early, again, so that they're not coming back and saying, somebody tells them they have to stop. That should not be the quality. We get treated that way as the policemen, mm-hmm. but we don't like it that way. We want you to come to us early, and so that we can help you navigate and turn before you hit the wall. Because when you hit that wall, you're stopped.
Yeah.
You're going to be waiting. You talk about FDA regulatory timelines. What happens often is they come back with the questions, and the timeline stops until you get those answers back to them. If your quality management system isn't organized so you get a complete design and development file and be able to provide them all those technical answers, the clinical answers, all those types of things, you're going to be late. So get to us early.
And Charles, you were saying that those systems are not like Salesforce to implement. They actually take time. You need to really bake that in early. Lynn, before I get to my last couple of questions, and I'm going to do a lightning round with you, I want to come back to one thing. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between what a CRO is responsible for and what a CEO thinks a CRO should be responsible for?
For me?
For you.
Yeah. Well, I think the collaboration with the CRO from sponsor standpoint, I think you always have to own it, right? You can't say, I'm outsource everything to CRO. If you outsource your protocol design, your site selection, your contract negotiation, you outsource them to make a decision on the budget, then yeah, they are responsible, but you never do that for the CRO. So I think you have to own the timeline. If you don't make the decision, when the CRO come back to you to say, hey, we need this, or this is the site budget, then the delay is on you. If you have a poorly designed protocol before CRO even come on board, the problem is on you, right? I think the CRO can help you with the execution, but you have to own the timeline. A good CRO, you can expect that they can identify issues and escalate issues to you early. I think
before they happen.
Before it happens. The second is that, ideally, they can also bring solutions to you. That will be the best you can expect from CRO.
And I think there's a difference between the sort of large global CROs that don't have that baked in local knowledge and sort of know that, yes, that PI is a wonderful PI, but his wife is having a troubled pregnancy. Like those are the kinds of things that local CROs are going to know much more deeply than the bigger ones.
That's absolutely true, yeah. And also you want to, if you're going to work with the IQVIA, your tiny project is going to fall through the cracks. So you work with the boutique CRO, like your project is their focus, right?
Everybody wants to be a big fish in a little pond. All right, in the 3 minutes we have left, we're going to do a lightning round. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions. First question, predictability or speed? If you had to choose one that matters most for a startup, would it be speed or predictability? Lynn?
Predictability.
Mark?
Predictability too, but you have to do that with some alacrity.
Understood. Lian?
Yeah, if you can't predict the timeline, you actually don't have a speed.
Everybody wants to know about predictability, but every client that I talk with wants speed, so.
And this is where I think we have to educate the clients, right? Like we need to help them understand that the speed can make them hit a brick wall. The predictability can help them see it in advance and go around it. So my last question for you. You're sitting in front of a MedTech CEO, first time. This is before their first trial. What is the one decision they need to make on day 0 that would avoid losing a year? We're going to start at the opposite end. Charles, what's that one decision?
The one decision is knowing that you have ownership's right to use data. Every medtech company is either starting from, within an institution or health system or needing to collaborate with them and really understanding contractually your rights and ownership in that data. Because if you get down the road and you start to have a dispute with that, collaborating partner, talk about timeline stop. It can, and especially when you're working with in-house counsel, which I love in-house counsel, but they don't respond as quickly as, say, outside counsel to, contract and negotiations. And if they're in the driver's seat at that stage, it's even worse.
Perfect. Lian?
I think plan for change and make sure your CRO partner understands it and they can help you.
Genius. Mark?
You need to plan. You have to have a design and development plan. It's one of the things that lots of development, lots of entrepreneurs hate to do. They hate to have to write things down. They have it in their head of what needs to be done. No. Just automatically writing it down increases your chances by 50% that you're going to achieve that end point. And that's where, again, quality management system, regulatory, all of these need to be planned out, write it down, and make sure that everybody else understands it. Then it enables the change. It enables you to have that predictability, all of those things that we've kind of mentioned.
Perfect. Lynn?
So I would go with, the great answers, but we have a sort of a different thing. We had a client recently, I was I talk through metaphors all the time. Client recently who was frankly putting scary shit in healthy children. That's a very expensive trial to insure. They didn't budget for it. So they actually had to stop and do a fundraise because their insurance was going to be way pricier. They were expecting like $3,500, which a lot of our trials are $3,500, but scary shit in healthy children is not.
No.
And so they actually, I mean, it wasn't a huge raise, but they had to go. I think just the friends and family sort of like, let's get over this hurdle, because they were ready to go, and then they called us late. So just, go ahead and call your broker, call us, get to go into your business plan, get a price.
Got it. So if there's one overriding message that folks can take away from what breaks MedTech timelines, if you want to avoid all of the things that are going to set you off track, plan holistically early. It was Mark who said if you're doing the gated, staged approach, you're already behind. So take a step back and think about everything, insurance, QMS, not protocol designed for a single study, but for your entire program timeline. And to Charles's point, get all of your ducks in a row, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but from an IP standpoint. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I hope you've learned something from this trial, and we are open for questions after this, so please find us because we're already over time. Thank you.